Today we're going to do something a little different. We're going on a historical journey to trace this single unbroken line through four of the most important conflicts in modern history. We're going to connect the dots and see how the end of one war really just set the stage for the next one.
So let's just jump right in with the big question. What on earth connects a rebellion over taxes in the 1700s to the creation of the atomic bomb? I know, it sounds like a massive stretch, right? But history really is like a chain reaction, just a series of dominoes. So let's push over that first one.
All right, so our story kicks off way back in the late 1700s, and it's all about the birth of a totally new kind of country, one that was forged in the fire of a rebellion and was built on this radical, new idea of what freedom could be. Now, the American Revolution, which ran from 1775 to 1783, wasn't just a war. It was really an explosion of an idea. You see, the colonists had this core belief that being taxed by a British parliament where they had 0 elected officials, well, that it was just fundamentally wrong. This whole idea, no taxation without representation, that was the spark that lit the entire fire. And that spark, it set off some huge moments. You had things like the Boston Tea Party, which was this really dramatic, in-your-face protest against British taxes. Then the colonies got organized, and they put George Washington in charge of their brand new army. And then, the real turning point. In 1776, they dropped the Declaration of Independence. That's when this went from just a protest to a full-blown revolution, to create a new independent country.
And here's the crucial part. At the very heart of this new nation was this powerful, beautiful ideal that all men are created equal. A totally revolutionary concept for the time. But right there in that principle was a deep, tragic contradiction. It was a promise that wasn't meant for millions of people living right there. And that single issue, it set the stage for the next great American conflict.
So, less than 100 years later, the United States had to face that contradiction head-on. That unfulfilled promise of freedom, it would literally break the nation in two.
The divide was stark. On one side, you had the Union, the North, which was against letting slavery spread into new parts of the country. And on the other side, you had the Confederacy, which was formed by 11 southern states that literally left the country for one main reason: to keep the institution of slavery. It was a clash of two totally different societies, economies, and moral viewpoints.
And hey, you don't have to guess what the cause was. They told us themselves, loud and clear. This quote is from Mississippi's own official document explaining why they were leaving the Union. It leaves absolutely no doubt. They said their position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. It was the engine driving the whole thing.
So the war itself raged from 1861 to 1865. It kicked off when the Confederates attacked Fort Sumter. A huge turning point came in 1863 when President Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president, issued the Emancipation Proclamation. That really shifted the purpose of the war to also include ending slavery. And finally, in 1865, the Union won.
And the result of that victory was just monumental. 4 million enslaved people were freed. But it was more than that. The Union victory created a newly unified, much more powerful nation. The industrial boom that happened in the North after the war turned America into an economic powerhouse, which is exactly what set the stage for it to step onto the world stage and play a decisive role in the global conflicts that were just around the corner.
And now the dominoes start to fall across the Atlantic Ocean. The scale of this story just explodes, going from a civil war to a global war, a true clash of ideologies that would pull in the entire planet.
You know, World War II didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was a direct result of all the leftover tensions from World War I mixed with a terrible global economic depression. This chaos created the perfect environment for extreme ideas to take hold, and the most dangerous of them all was the rise of Nazism in Germany under its leader, Adolf Hitler.
So the war officially starts in 1939 when Germany invades Poland. Now, the United States, which had become this industrial giant, gets pulled right into the middle of it in 1941. And that was after the Empire of Japan launched a massive surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. The war then raged for 6 incredibly long years, finally ending in 1945.
There were basically two teams. You had the Axis powers. That's mainly Germany, Italy, and Japan, led by guys like Hitler and Mussolini. And fighting them, you had the Allied powers, which was this huge alliance including the US under Franklin D. Roosevelt, the UK under Winston Churchill, and the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin.
The human cost of this war it's just almost impossible to wrap your head around. Over 60 million people died. That makes it the single deadliest conflict in all of human history. And the way this war ended would directly draw the battle lines for the next major conflict.
So the ashes of World War II were barely even cold when this new, really strange kind of conflict started up. It was a war where the two main enemies never actually fought each other directly, but the tension it created held the entire world hostage for almost 50 years.
Let's be honest, the alliance between the US and the Soviet Union was always one of convenience. I mean, they had one thing in common, a shared enemy. Once that enemy was gone, their huge ideological differences came rushing right back to the surface. They were the only two superpowers left standing, and they immediately became rivals.
At its core, this was a conflict of ideas. On one side, you had the United States and its allies who believed in capitalism and democracy. They formed a military alliance called NATO. And on the other side was the Soviet Union and its sphere of influence, all committed to communism, who formed their own rival alliance, the Warsaw Pact.
And Winston Churchill, he gave this new reality a name that stuck. In 1946, he declared that an Iron Curtain had fallen across Europe. It was this perfect, powerful metaphor for the ideological and the very real, physical wall that was now separating East from West.
And this standoff played out all over the globe through a series of terrifying crises and proxy wars. That's where the superpowers would back opposite sides in a conflict instead of fighting each other directly. You see it with the building of the Berlin Wall, the incredibly tense Cuban Missile Crisis in '62 when the world held its breath, the intense competition of the space race, and in brutal, long wars like the one in Vietnam.
The symbolic end finally came in 1989, with those incredible images of the Berlin Wall coming down. That was followed by the official collapse of the Soviet Union itself in 1991, which finally brought the 45-year-long Cold War to an end.
Okay, so we've followed this chain all the way from a colonial rebellion to the collapse of a superpower. But what does any of this mean for us, right here, right now? Let's try and connect these echoes of the past to the world we're all living in today.
The world we live in was literally forged in the fire of these four wars. They redrew the maps of entire continents. They led to the creation of huge international groups like the United Nations, which was designed to try and stop this from ever happening again. And all the alliances, the rivalries, the unresolved tensions from these struggles, you can still see them playing out in the news headlines every single day.
And that really leaves us with one last big question to think about. From the ideals of the American Revolution to the nuclear fear of the Cold War, are these events really over? Are they just things in a history book? Or is history not something we just look back on, but something we're actually living inside of every single day? That's something to chew on. Thanks for joining me.